I'm Ben Reiman, and this is Behaviour Speak. Where do you see ABA in Australia over the next decade?
If I'm successful in my objectives, and if ABA Australia is successful in their objectives, then I think we'll be in a pretty good place. But what I would really like to see is better recognition of the field and the really valuable and important work that we do. I would like to see ABA also better represented outside of the disability sector. You know, like we're starting to gain traction within education settings as well. Like 2 of the states in Australia now sort of endorse, and I think Queensland maybe even has like scholarships for like teachers to go and do a master's in ABA, which is like amazing. But, you know, looking at like health and aged care and like all of these other sectors that I think we could contribute really valuably in. I guess I would also be aiming for like a lot of improvement in how ABA is understood and perceived by the mainstream public and by the media. The primary problem is a lack of understanding about what we are and what we aren't. We have this really rigorous education, really rigorous professional standards, and that we're, you know, exceptionally skilled at working with a specific population and, you know, applying specific principles to build capacity. ABA is very much still seen as EIBI. We'll hear things from funders and regulators like, well, we don't fund programs. And it's like, well, I'm not asking you to fund a program. I'm asking you to fund a professional to provide early intervention. And I'm not necessarily asking for 20 to 40 hours of therapy a week. There's a lot of different things that I can do to support this person. And that, I think, has been one of the really big challenges. The other one is that people hear the word behaviour and assume that we're talking about problem behaviour. And so why would this person need a behaviour analyst? They don't engage in behaviours of concern. And so understanding, I guess, just how broad our skill set is and the types of things that we can help with, the types of settings that we can work in, the types of people we can work with. And that's a really huge barrier in Australia at the moment to getting good recognition.
Behaviour analysis looks a little different depending on where you practice. And today's conversation offers a fascinating look at how one country is navigating rapid change. My guest is Niesha Illingworth, psychologist, certified behaviour analyst, clinical director of Bright Eyes, PhD candidate at Charles Sturt University, and outgoing president of ABA Australia. With nearly 2 decades in the field, Niesha brings a unique perspective on balancing clinical practice, research, professional leadership, and systems advocacy. We explore Australia's evolving behaviour analytic landscape, including professional self-regulation, government policy, early intervention, and the challenges of building public understanding of contemporary behaviour analysis. Niesha also shares her doctoral research on the BALANCE program, a prevention-focused approach that asks an important question: why wait until severe behavior develops before providing support? Along the way, we discuss culturally responsive practice, supporting Indigenous families, bridging the research to practice gap, and why the future of our profession depends as much on advocacy as it does on science. Here's my conversation with Niesha Illingworth. Welcome, Niesha, to Behaviour Speak.
Hi, Ben. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited. Before we get started, I just want to acknowledge I am an uninvited settler-occupier on the traditional lands of the Islam and First Nation, who have been stewards of this land since time immemorial. So, Niesha, you've been in the field for 18 years as a psychologist at BCBA.
Yes.
How'd you find your way into behavior analysis?
So I first came into behaviour analysis. I was in my first year of my psychology undergraduate degree, and we had 2 women who were running, I guess, one of the only ABA clinics at the time in Australia come and present a guest lecture to us. And it was about ABA and it was about autism, but it was, you know, predominantly a pitch to try and recruit junior therapists or sort of RPTs. And so I went and did my training with them and I was just immediately hooked. I loved, you know, how precise and technical it was. I had so much data on, you know, my own performance in that space, as well as, you know, really being able to track, I guess, how a learner was progressing. And all of that was very enticing to me. I think it's really scary going into a helping profession like psychology at the time and feeling that weight of, you know, how am I going to know if I'm doing a good job? And ABA made that really concrete and really measurable right from the get-go, which just made a lot of sense to me. And then I met my first kid and I was even more hooked. And he was 4 at the time, so I still keep in touch with the family. And he was just so full of life and so joyous and so cheeky. But he was also non-speaking, level 3 autism, like a complete handful. And I don't know, I watched him learning with his BCBA at the time. And I think prior to that experience, I hadn't had a lot of contact with individuals with autism or profound disabilities. And so seeing how capable he was of learning in the right context was, really inspiring. And yeah, that was it. I was sold, and I've been in it ever since.
So how's he doing now?
He's doing well. He's big. He's a
Yeah.
big kid. His family moved, but, we're still friends on Facebook, and I still get to follow him and see how he's doing. But he's a fully grown adult now, which is exciting. And still, he will require lifelong support, very much fits that profile of profound autism, but, a really beautiful soul. And because of quality early intervention, has a lot of the skills that he needs to, live a safe and dignified life, even if he's requiring a lot of support. So, yeah.
And do you think, you did what you could with what you had, because that was 18 years ago. Do you think you would have done things differently now? Or do you do things, you must do things differently now. So do you ever reflect on that? Without,
I do. I
feeling bad
absolutely
about it?
do. I think that the field has evolved a lot, in 18 years, obviously. And I think whilst our aims have always been compassionate, maybe the means haven't always been as compassionate as they could be. And so, even though that child really loved therapy and really loved his therapist and, had a great time, there's absolutely things that I would do differently now. Yeah. But his family would still, sing the praises of all of his therapists. He would still give us a hug when he sees us, like it's not quite as black and white as people would like you to think in terms of what ABA historically has looked like. Yeah.
Tell me a bit about your sort of educational and career journey. You're now a clinical director, president of ABA Australia. How'd you get there?
I did my psych degree first. And even though I was working in ABA, throughout my entire undergrad degree, I always knew that I wanted to do my psych registration first. It's what I'd set out to do, but there also wasn't at the time I didn't see, a lot of stability, a lot of recognition for behaviour analysts. There was really just, 2 or 3 kind of clinics at the time, whereas psychology was this big, booming, really established profession. And so I did my undergraduate degree. I became a psychologist. I had a couple of kids. And then when I returned to work, that's when I went back and did my master's in behaviour analysis and went on to become a BCBA. And then in terms of, I guess, the move to clinical director position, I worked at a major clinic in Sydney for a really long time. Then I transitioned to Bright Eyes, which is where I work now as a clinical director. And I worked in Sydney initially with a wonderful woman called Alex Brown, who's now my business partner. And then when I moved to the Blue Mountains, so it's about an hour and a half outside of Sydney, I started a second branch of the business. There really wasn't a lot in terms of early intervention out here, certainly no other ABA providers. And so it was quite successful. It grew quite quickly. And that's when I took over ownership of that separate branch. So that's kind of what my clinical journey has looked like. We now have about 20 staff out here in the Blue Mountains Clinic, which is a mix of psychologists, behaviour analysts, support workers, therapy assistants, which is again like, RBTs, and a couple of admin staff as well. And then about the same time that I embarked on my ABA Australia leadership journey, I also started a PhD. So I'm also doing a PhD full-time through Charles Sturt University, which is a regional rural university out here. And that's with the School of Psychology, but it's very much a behaviour analytic research question. And so I'm about 2 years into that journey as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. And the Blue Mountains, is that a rural area? It sounds rural.
I guess it's regional. It's not rural. I don't really know how to describe it. I guess it's a lot of Australia. Australia is such a vast country, right? It's so big. And so we do have classifications around like what constitutes like a regional and a rural area. So we are, in a lot of ways regional, but for some sort of classification purposes wouldn't even quite qualify as regional because the Blue Mountains itself is too big. But it's essentially one giant national park with little towns sprinkled all the way up the mountain. So it's really beautiful. It's a great place to live, a really great place to raise kids. But it means that we get this whole breadth of clients. Like we have clients from like the Blue Mountains. To drive from like the top of the Blue Mountains down to the bottom town probably takes about an hour, 45 minutes an hour. And then we also have families who come from further west. So like properly regional and rural New South Wales, and some families who come from, more towards Sydney up to the clinic as well. Yeah.
Do you serve Indigenous families at all?
We do.
Parents?
Yeah, we do. And there's certainly more Indigenous families out here than there was when I was practicing in Sydney. So when I was practicing in Sydney, I was based on the North Shore, which is quite an affluent and predominantly white, area. And so it was, in a lot of ways, quite the culture shock moving to the Blue Mountains. It's a very different population. I had to brush up quite quickly on trauma-informed care. We worked with a lot of individuals, through DCJ, which is like our child protection kind of service, a much lower socioeconomic status, a lot more Indigenous families. Yeah, it's a very different landscape up here. So yes, we do work with Indigenous families, and that's something that we're always trying to do better. I think you connected me with Deb, which was amazing. Yeah, Deb Fernando. So we
Did
did
you
a staff
connect with her?
training. Yeah, we did.
Amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so she came and did a staff training
Right on.
with us, which was really, really informative actually. Like
I'm
I've
so
done
glad.
I've done a bit of cultural competency and safety training before, but Deb just made it seem so simple.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of the messages have really stuck with me. And then she's gone on to do ongoing mentorship for an Indigenous practitioner we have here at the clinic as well. So that's really exciting.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So happy to hear that. Why a PhD?
Well, her PhD, I've always wanted to do a PhD. I loved uni so much. And I especially loved, the research component, the thesis that I got to do as part of my psych undergrad. And I think, obviously we are scientist practitioners. We're always referring back to the literature. We have to be making evidence-based decisions. But I think what we see in practice a lot is that the research practice gap is pretty significant, and it can be really hard to bridge the gap between, what you see in published literature and what you're actually doing in the clinic. And so I was really motivated to embark on a PhD that was going to be practical, informative, and is very, very much tied to my clinical work as well, which has made it easier in a lot of ways, I think, to manage sort of the clinical load and the academic load. But yeah, it's going well. I love it. I'm a bit sad that it's only a year and a bit away until it's finished. So I will, probably continue doing some academic work once it's finished as well.
And what's your dissertation topic?
So I'm looking at the Balance program, which was developed by Dr. Kelsey Rupel and Dr. Greg Hanley. So the Balance program is a parent implemented program designed to prevent the development of severe problem behavior in children who are most at risk. So Kelsey has published a research article on it, and then Dr. Cara Lacroix did her dissertation on it as well. So there's only, it's emerging literature, but it's very much rooted in a much bigger body of literature, which, basically says that, the 60 years of behaviour analytic literature that we have could potentially inform preventative and ask that question, why are we waiting for problem behaviour to get severe before we intervene?
Yeah.
We know how to treat it. We know the protective skills that we will teach once it is developed. So why aren't we just teaching those skills as a baseline to children who are most at risk?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And these are, if I remember it, I did an interview with someone on the Balance program. It was like the third interview I ever did.
Okay.
So this was like 5 years ago. So it's blurry, but I believe these were things you could do with kids like pre-diagnosis, like quite young kids. But
yeah, so it doesn't require a child to have a diagnosis necessarily. All of the children in my research trial, actually no, not all of them have diagnoses. Half of them do, and some of them don't. They have sort of developmental delays and emerging problem behavior, but not necessarily a formal diagnosis. And I think it's, I don't know if I was subconsciously reading the tea leaves of where we would be in terms of early intervention in Australia, but it actually has a lot of significance to the early intervention landscape here in Australia at the moment. So it will be interesting to see, whether I'm at all successful in persuading the government that, preventative approaches are appropriate. But so far we've had really good outcomes and really high social validity as well, which I think is incredibly important in the work that we do with families.
And tell me about, I've never heard of Charles Sturt University. Tell me about that program.
Yeah.
Has it been around? Has it been around for a while, or?
Charles Sturt University has been around for, a long time. I think it wasn't a university that was really high on my radar, if I'm going to be totally honest. It's not one of, I guess the major universities in Australia. So I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Sydney, and then I did my behaviour analysis master's at Monash University. And Charles Sturt has been a really different experience. It's I don't really know. I'm trying to think of how to describe it. It's just, and this may also be the stage that I'm at in terms of education, right? Like I'm not an undergrad student, I'm not a master's student, I'm a PhD candidate. And so maybe you are just treated a little bit differently anyway. But it's been incredibly supportive. It's like the quality of supervision that I've had has been fantastic. The library support, the financial support, it's all been amazing.
Do you have a certification with the International Behavior Analysis Organization, the Qualified Applied Behavior Analysis Credentialing Board, the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, or are certified through your region's Behavior Analyst Credentialing Board? You can earn continuing education units for this episode by going to www.behaviorspeak.com and clicking on CEUs. The first secret word is compass.
It's just very collaborative. It's very warm. There isn't this, dog eat dog kind of mentality. Yeah. So it's been a really, really nice experience. And I think I got onto it because the executive dean, I think is his position, Lewis Bezo, who is behavior analysis trained, but I don't actually think he's behavior analyst, but he studied in New Zealand, and I believe has a master's in behavior analysis, but he's, the executive dean for the Faculty of Business, Justice and Behavioral Science. So it's quite a real lump of different faculties together. So there's like policing and things in with psychology, but I'm not sure how they decided that, but it's been lovely to work with them. Yeah, but he came to one of our conferences in ABA Australia and was, talking about what an untapped resource practitioners are to the research field, and was kind of saying, you guys have the access, you have the knowledge, you have the client base to be conducting really high quality research, and a lot of you aren't doing it. And why not, And so I, inquired into a PhD and started pretty quickly thereafter.
And are there other behavior analysts that are professors in there, or?
No, none at all, which has presented at times a little bit of a challenge, but, also a real opportunity, I think, to advocate for what quality behavior analytic research looks like and maybe correct some misconceptions in, the broader academic world. But so Dr. Erin Leaf from Monash sat on my confirmation panel, so it was really good to have her expertise in that as well. And Dr. Kelsey Rupel is one of my external advisors. So she's there for any of the, big kind of behavior analytic research questions. And then my other supervisors are both from the Faculty of Psychology, but not practicing psychologists either. So it's been interesting to navigate, but I don't know. I know we'll talk about this a little bit later, but Australia is such a supportive professional community. And so it's nice to know that I have people, like if I needed to email Erin and ask her a question, I could do that. Or, it's very supportive. It's very collaborative, which has been really helpful, I think.
Maybe you'll end up like adjuncting there or something and teaching a course or something, right?
Maybe. Well, I do a bit of lecturing there already.
Yeah.
I teach into the postgraduate psychology courses, specifically on assessment and treatment of neurodevelopmental disabilities, which has been, really rewarding and really interesting as well. I think especially because there is still so much misconception about what ABA is and what quality contemporary behavior analytic practice looks like. And so to be able to sort of, get budding psychologists and say, hey, this is what it actually looks like. What questions do you have for me? Has been, I think, a really valuable experience.
How would you describe the current state of ABA in Australia?
That's a big question. I think I'm hopeful. We have faced a lot of challenges within the funding landscape that we exist in at the moment in Australia. And so there's been really huge growth in the ABA profession over the last decade, especially in the last 5 years, I would say, since Monash and Griffith have started, well, it must be more than 5 years, offering their master's courses in behaviour analysis. So people no longer have to go and, pay to study overseas. They can do it here in Australia, where we have good financial support for education as well, which, it makes a really big difference, I think, in how accessible it is. But we continue to face pretty significant challenges in terms of, misconceptions about ABA, a real lack of understanding about what it is and what it isn't. I would say is probably the biggest challenge. And even though there is anti-ABA rhetoric in Australia, what I've learned over the last year with, a lot of active advocacy that I've been doing is that isn't actually the primary problem. The primary problem is a lack of understanding about what we are and what we aren't. And, that's misunderstanding at, I guess, the qualification level and the expertise level as well. Like, I think a lot of people don't realize that certified behaviour analysts, which is the Australian equivalent of a BCBA, are master's trained professionals, that we have this really rigorous education, really rigorous professional standards, and that we're, exceptionally skilled at working with a specific population and, applying specific principles to build capacity. And so not early intervention, ABA is very much still seen as EIBI. And so, we'll hear things from funders and regulators like, well, we don't fund programs. And it's like, well, I'm not asking you to fund a program. I'm asking you to fund a professional to provide early intervention. And I'm not necessarily asking for 20 to 40 hours of therapy a week. There's a lot of different things that I can do to support this person. And that, I think, has been one of the really big challenges. The other one is that people hear the word behavior and assume that we're talking about problem behavior. And so why would this person need a behavior analyst? They don't engage in behaviors of concern. And so understanding, I guess, just how broad our skill set is and the types of things that we can help with, the types of settings that we can work in, the types of people we can work with. And I think that's a really huge barrier in Australia at the moment to getting good recognition. But there's a lot of good things as well, I think, happening in ABA. Like, the growth is fantastic. It's meaning that our voice is bigger. We have more of a platform to amplify the message of what quality behavior analysis looks like. But yeah, it's challenging. I'm not going to lie. It's been a tough year in the presidency in terms of advocating for the profession. And I think when I was a member of ABA Australia and I was on the outside looking in, it was really easy to kind of think, the association isn't doing enough. We need to be increasing our advocacy. And I think to some extent that's true. But since I've been in it, I can see just how many systemic barriers there are to progress. And it's been especially in the last year, a really rapidly changing policy and government environment that has meant that we're the goalposts are constantly changing. The people you're meant to be talking to are changing. The focus of the government, the bureaucratic landscape is just shifting on a month-by-month basis at the moment. And so I feel like we're getting there, but it's incredibly challenging from an advocacy perspective. Not sure if that was really your question. The current state of ABA in Australia.
Yeah, that's how things are going. I mean,
yeah,
I don't think your problems are Australia problems. I mean,
they're not. Yeah.
Do you ever think about just not being called a behavior analyst?
Absolutely. Yeah, I've definitely had that, especially because I have the dual qualification of psychology as well. And so I've definitely known people who, I have a friend who's a psychologist, and she was like, I've just stopped telling people I'm also a behavior analyst. People see BCBA and they don't want to work with me. Or the other thing that we have in Australia is something called a key worker model, which is, heavily endorsed by the government. And that's, a professional that is essentially expected to do it all. So, they're expected to collaborate with occupational therapists, speech therapists, psychologists, physiotherapists, social workers, and pull everything together and just be this one point of primary therapeutic contact for the child and for the family, which, one, isn't sustainable. It also grossly underestimates the skill of each of those professions. And whilst there is some benefit to it, I really don't think in practice it's doing what it's meant to be doing in the early intervention landscape. But I have also had people say, well, I just call myself a key worker because at least the government understands what that is, which I can understand the pull to it. I really can. I do think, though, that we have a collective responsibility not to back down from the title that we've worked really, really hard for. I'm a psychologist as well. It was a lot easier to become a psychologist than it was to become a behavior analyst, if I'm being, frank with you. And so the disparity in terms of recognition and, public perception on the merits of those two professions is, it's soul destroying at times. But I do feel like we are gaining traction. There was, we had like a hashtag on LinkedIn a little while ago that I think it was either Kristen Bailey or Jill Hellerman started, that was like proud to be a behavior analyst. And someone emailed me this week to talk about like reigniting that, like being like, should we like start this going? And I was like, absolutely, because like I'm so proud to be a behavior analyst. And I think a lot of us have been really scared to engage in that advocacy conversation. And there is generally a perception that, we won't be received well. Like I said earlier, that hasn't actually been my experience. It isn't the, ABA is abuse. I don't want to work with you. You're a terrible profession. It's just, I don't actually understand what it is that you do. And when we break it down for them and we say, this is what it looks like, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm measuring, this is how I monitor assent and withdrawal of assent. And, this is how I'm holding the child or the individual's, dignity and safety and all of this at the forefront. People kind of go, oh, that sounds great. It's like, yeah, that's what ABA is. And I know that it maybe isn't necessarily what ABA has historically been, or what it is in every context, but it's very much what it is in the Australian context. And so I think as a collective, we need to get a lot braver in terms of, pushing back against that narrative and having those tough conversations. So no, I will not be dropping my behaviour analyst title ever.
And so what do you think makes the Australian context unique, say, compared to North America?
I mean, I haven't practiced in North America, so I could be wrong. Obviously, I know a lot of people that have, and, I visited quite often for conferences and things like that. I think internationally as a field, we are seeing this really big push towards contemporary, compassionate applications of the science.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what's maybe a little bit different in Australia is that because we are sort of a younger and smaller field, it's been a lot easier to gain traction in that. And so, whereas I think in, North America, they're having to undo a lot of learning, undo a lot of work, correct a lot of, misconceptions, like really convince people that this is the way to do things. We haven't had that issue in Australia. Like it's, especially for the sort of, the cohort over the last few years who have just done their behavior analytic training and have moved into the field, that's just built in. It would be in the content at Monash and Griffith. It's very much, I guess, the flavour of the professional community and the disability community more broadly here in Australia. And so it's just a given. And I think that's meant that we have this cohort of professionals who I think often without maybe even realizing it, are practicing in very neurodiversity affirming, very culturally sensitive, very, compassionate ways, which is amazing. So yeah, I'm really, really proud of the professional community here. And I think it was Erin Leaf who was saying at a conference, I think she was in the States maybe, or she was somewhere else. And a speaker at a conference said something like, we need to get better at practicing in like a compassionate and human rights focused way, like the Australians do. And Erin said she was in the audience, was like, yes, and I think it's wonderful to know that is how international behaviour analysts view the work that we're doing here, because it very much is a human rights focused of the science, which is fantastic.
I think a lot of that is thanks to her.
Yeah.
Because she uses that language quite a bit when she does her talks around the world and the papers she writes.
Yeah, exactly. And really, I guess funnels that perception into the professionals she's training at Monash and, the individuals that they're then teaching. And so, yeah, she's been essential, I think, in shaping what the context of behaviour analysis looks like at the moment in Australia.
So you say it's pretty young in Australia. What's sort of the origins of ABA? Yeah.
So I think when I first started practicing, which would have been in 2008, I think, there was about 20 to 30 behaviour analysts in Australia. And so they were all BCBAs, obviously. We didn't have any sort of other certification for them yet. And now we sit at, so ABA Australia has about 650 members and about 350 to 400 of those are certified behaviour analysts. Yeah. And then outside of that, we would also have a number of individuals in Australia who are BCBAs who haven't, yet sort of come on board with ABA Australia to do their CBA. So yeah, I'd say probably sitting at around 400 certified behaviour analysts in Australia, which obviously isn't enough.
Right.
If you think about, the population and what a vast country Australia is, but it's really significant growth in a period of, 15 to 20 years, I think. It's grown exponentially in the last 5 years. So yeah, it's different, but we're still small, like we're still young.
Yeah.
And, that has a lot of benefits though, I think, in terms of what a close-knit and collaborative group we are. And when, things like compassionate, trauma-informed applications come, it's easy to disseminate. It's like everyone's right there. You just kind of go, well, this is how we're practicing now. And everyone goes, great, got it, which is awesome.
You have a kind of a self-regulation model for ABA. Can you help me understand how that works?
Yeah. So self-regulation is, I think it's really important to, I guess, state at the outset that self-regulation doesn't necessarily mean less regulation. And again, I think this is a common misconception when people hear the word self-regulating. So in Australia, we have sort of a peak body called AHPRA, which is the Australian Health Professionals Regulation Agency. And so they're responsible for regulating, I would say, the majority of health and allied health professions in Australia. So medical practitioners, psychologists, occupational therapists, I think even physiotherapists, like all of those would sit under AHPRA. But there are a number of, really high quality allied health professions that sit outside of AHPRA. And AHPRA has, I guess, essentially closed ranks. It's been a very long time since I think OTs were the last people to get in. And that was a really big push for OTs as well. And OTs are obviously a much bigger body than behaviour analysts are. And so we did initially approach AHPRA to try and do our regulation through them. And it was kind of a firm no. They don't really take on any more professions. They haven't for a really long time. But I think one of their other, reasons was around the risk to the population. And there was a perception that the risk to the Australian population, should we not be registered with them, was not so great that they felt that they had to, include us under their umbrella. So then we embarked on a process of professional self-regulation. And so what that means is that ABA Australia is the peak body responsible for regulating behaviour analysis in Australia. At the moment, we have no title protections, which is challenging. So anyone can technically call themselves a behaviour analyst, but what we are really pushing for is adequate government recognition that if you hold a CBA, which is a Certified Behaviour Analyst, or CBAU, which is our undergraduate qualification, much like the BCABA qualification, if you hold that certification with Australia, then the public and the government can have faith that you adhere to the appropriate education and regulation standards. So within that model, we have education standards like professional practice, so supervised practice standards, ongoing supervision, ongoing CPD, a code of ethics, a scope of competence, all of the things that you would expect from a regulated health profession, but we just do it within ABA Australia. Does that make sense?
It does. Is there a long-term goal to still get into that other group, like to have them accept you one day?
Not necessarily. The long-term goal would instead to be more strongly affiliated with and tied to the other self-regulating health professions in Australia. So there is a large number of other health professions, like including speech pathologists and counsellors in Australia, who also self-regulate.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it's not, and I think people don't recognize that. They're like, oh, self-regulation is weaker regulation. And I'm like, would you consider a speech pathologist to be poorly regulated? And they'll be like, well, no. I'm like, it's actually exactly the same thing. But there are two peak bodies of self-regulating health professionals. Actually, AHPRA might not just be it's very confusing. There's AHPRA, which is what I was talking about before, and then there's AHPA, which just doesn't have the R. And so AHPA is the Allied Health Professionals Association. And then there's another one called NASRIP, which is the National Alliance of Self-Regulating Health Professions. And so our goal is to gain full membership with both of those bodies. And that adds, I guess, an additional layer of recognition, an additional layer of protections. You have to have very high standards to get membership into either of those bodies. And so it's another layer of confidence, I guess, in the quality of our regulation. We have qualifying membership with NASREP, but not yet full membership. And we haven't yet been successful in getting membership to AHPA. And so that's something that we're actively working on at the moment in terms of tweaking some of our policies and procedures, updating our website. They're relatively superficial things, in my view, that need to happen in order for us to meet those standards. Like the foundation has already been built, because that, I guess, the biggest foundation really is education, supervision, protection of the individuals that you're working with. Yeah. But I would say that's a short to medium term goal.
So you feel like these groups will accept you once you...
Yeah, I do. I mean, NASREP has already they've given us that qualifying membership, and they've provided us with pretty, I guess, minimal feedback on what it is that we need to do to apply for full membership. And then ARPA has kind of said, full membership with NASREP would make it easier for you to have full membership with us. And so that's something we're working on at the moment.
And does any of this connect to funding?
Yes and no, I guess, is the bigger question, maybe the more appropriate answer. It's funding in Australia for behaviour analytic services it's the real Wild West at the moment. It's been a really wild ride. And so we have in Australia the National Disability Insurance Scheme, obviously recognising that not all behaviour analysts work within the disability sector, but this is the primary scheme through which a lot of behaviour analytic professionals are funded. Prior to the NDIS coming into action about a decade ago, we had very little funding for disability, like therapeutic services for disability at all. We had something called Helping Children with Autism, which was a pretty small packet of funding, but behaviour analysts were actually listed as one of the eligible professionals under that scheme. So recognised by the government, 20 years ago as being one of the professions that could help individuals with autism. I would say we've gone backwards a little bit. So we've gone from there to the NDIS. I think a lot of really amazing things have happened under the NDIS. We have much, much greater access to disability supports. But I think what the government did is probably underestimated how much support was needed by the disability community, and also probably didn't set up at the outset good enough rules and regulation for the types of professionals that could provide services under the NDIS. And so I think that those rules potentially became a little bit looser than they should have been because the demand for services was so high, and there was a real sense that they needed to meet the urgency of the community and provide them with services. So for a really long time, we've been able to function under the NDIS as what's called an other professional. So that's, there are all these different insurance line items for different professionals. And then there's this kind of catch-all bucket, which is lots of different professions fall in there. But, our argument is that behaviour analysts shouldn't be in that bucket. We are a defined, credentialed, well-governed professional body. And we're also the professional body that has some of the most rigorous evidence on building capacity for individuals with disabilities. And that is, I guess, the entire... the main argument of the NDIS, or the main goal of the NDIS, is to build capacity so that individuals with disabilities are less reliant on external supports over time, right? Which is exactly what we do and what we've done for a really, really long time. And not just within the early intervention or autism space. We're excellent at building capacity across the entire lifespan. But that isn't really well recognised by the government at the moment. And so the NDIS has certainly allowed individuals with disabilities to access significantly more support, life-changing supports, right? But because it has, gone beyond the government's expectations so much, there is a real, climate at the moment of trying to rein costs in. And that has very significant impacts on the individuals who rely on the NDIS for support, but it also has a significant impact on the professions that rely on the NDIS for their income and for the abilities to sustain their work. So it's getting recognition with NASREP and ARPA will put us in a much stronger position to argue to the NDIS that we need to be well recognised and to have our own line item and not be in this catch-all bucket. But it's not our only line of advocacy. There are lots of other things that we're working on at the moment as well. So yeah, it will help things. I don't know if it's necessarily essential, just because I think that behaviour analysts aren't the major problem within the NDIS. There's a lot of non-evidence-based practices, non-qualified professionals working in the insurance scheme at the moment, which I think is the bigger problem. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. It's changing, honestly, on a week-by-week, month-by-month basis at the moment. Yeah. So we'll have to see how things play out over the next 6 to 12 months, I think.
And is there a lot of political influence? Is that why, without getting into the details of it all? Is that part of it? Is it that politics are changing, or is it?
Yeah, definitely. Politics are changing. And I think one of the promises of the Labor government, which is the government that we're under right now, was to rein in the cost of the NDIS. And that has been done a little bit clumsily so far. So one of the main arguments was to move children with mild to moderate autism, which doesn't exist, right? So a weird way for the government to start this conversation, off the NDIS into something called foundational supports. And, the rationale behind that was partly good. It is certainly a problem that the NDIS has become the primary avenue through which to access early intervention or early childhood supports. And if you go back like 10, 15, 20 years, that wasn't the case. We had things like helping children with autism. We had community centres. We had like all of these other options where children who maybe had some developmental concerns but didn't necessarily have autism or hadn't been diagnosed with autism, the families could go and they could access support, really readily in these community-based options. Because the NDIS has gotten so big, a lot of those options have closed down. And so families now feel like they must get a diagnosis and they must get onto the NDIS in order to get the support they need. And so that's seen a really big influx of kids onto the NDIS who maybe wouldn't have been there before. So the government's thinking that we need to reestablish those community-based supports is sound, but it's being done very quickly. It's being rolled out far too quickly without, I think, a good understanding of what it's going to look like, the professional workforce behind it, how we're going to monitor quality, who makes decisions about who these children with mild to moderate needs are. Like, is it the health professionals or is it the government?
Right.
There are all of these questions. So, yes, it's rapidly changing.
Yeah.
There was also a new bill proposed about a month ago by the government to make really broad and sweeping changes to the powers of the executives in the NDIS. That has caused very significant concern across Australia. But thankfully, there has been really significant pushback, especially from the disability community. And so that bill is under sort of extensive review by the Senate at the moment. And I'm hopeful that we will see some meaningful changes that protect the rights and the safety of individuals with disabilities in Australia. But I would say it's highly political at the moment, and it's very rapidly changing. It's a full-time job just to stay across the policy changes and the bureaucratic environment, which is not something I learnt in my ABA Masters or my psych degree. So that's been a fun learning experience.
As far as the CBA certification, is it a similar path to get there, like certain coursework, exam, all that kind of thing?
Yeah. Well, we don't have an exam yet. But the coursework requirements really modeled off the BACB's coursework requirements. So for a really long time, we've been functioning off the verified course sequence. Now that has been sunset by the BACB, we're moving to ABAI's tiered model. And at the moment, we're in sort of a 10-year transition phase for Australian universities. Like, obviously, when you change the education requirements, you have to give universities long enough to implement those changes. So at the moment, I would say the two universities are still teaching to that verified course sequence sort of, framework, even if it's not called that anymore, which we're still recognizing. And then over time, they'll shift to ABAI's tiered model. So the education standards are essentially identical to the BACB standards. We then have a 1,500-hour supervised fieldwork, supervised practice. We don't have an exam at the moment. And it will be interesting actually to see if we necessarily move towards the exam pathway. I think exams are being sort of utilized less and less by other allied health bodies because they're not necessarily a really good indicator of competency or quality, right? Not in the same way that supervised practice and high quality supervision is. Yeah. So, the other thing is that the practicality and the cost of getting an exam off the ground in Australia it's extremely expensive. And so I think as an association and a profession, we need to really be looking at our priorities. Is it important that we be spending all this money on getting an exam off the ground so that we can mirror the BACB's, model, or should we maybe be investing that money in better recognition with the government? I should just say that these are very much my opinions, not necessarily the opinions of ABA Australia or any of my other affiliated institutions. Probably should have started with that. But that's kind of what it looks like at the moment. Then we have ongoing CPD requirements. We have a code of ethics, and we also have a complaints process. If someone is, reported to be in breach of the code of ethics, then someone can make a complaint to ABA Australia, and that's investigated by our ethics committee. Yeah.
So you've also mentioned rapid growth in terms of services, in terms of professionals in the last 5 years. What's that look like? Has growth kind of outpaced training and quality assurance? What's that all? Is it going too fast?
Don't necessarily think that the profession has grown too fast. I have a lot of faith in the quality of the education that, up and coming behaviour analysts are provided by Monash and Griffith. I think, the quality of that is really fantastic. I also have a lot of faith in that process of professional, practice and like supervised practice. I think that's great. I think the difficulties that we're facing at the moment in terms of, monitoring and adhering to quality, one is in supervision standards. I think that we as an association need to improve what quality supervision looks like, how we're capturing data on that, how we're monitoring and auditing supervision practices in Australia. I think that's something we need to improve. And we do have a working group that is working on that at the moment. Like, we already have supervision standards, but they need to be better, I think. And then I think the other thing that makes it really difficult is the funding landscape in Australia at the moment. It used to be that, you went and became a behaviour analyst and then you worked in like a clinic where you had really rigorous ongoing supervision and you were, like a little fish in a big pond. And that's kind of how everyone's career started, right? It's certainly how mine started. And there are so many benefits to that, to receiving that continuous high quality supervision from people who are much more experienced than you, and to being accountable to your peers and your bosses and your supervisors all within that work context. What we're seeing at the moment, because of the funding landscape, is that people can either come out of, their degree and go straight into private practice. So we're seeing people coming out of uni and opening practices and going into a clinical director position right off the bat, right? And that's because the funding is there, the need is there, and they're able to do that. The other thing that we're seeing, well, just firstly, that's obviously a really significant problem for all of the reasons that I just outlined, right? Like, they don't have someone providing, hopefully they're still accessing good quality supervision, they're still adhering to CPD requirements, etc. But it's not the same as, growing up professionally in this clinic context where you're getting all of this support and feedback all the time. The other problem is positive behaviour support within the NDIS. And so even though behaviour analysts aren't well recognised under our insurance scheme, we have this bucket of funding for behaviour support. And in order to be a behaviour support practitioner under the NDIS, you don't actually have to have any formal qualifications. So you can come straight out of your undergrad degree even, or maybe not even any degree, fill in something that's called a practitioner self-assessment. So you as a practitioner assess yourself against the competencies of behaviour support. Yeah. And you have to have a supervisor sign off on that. I wouldn't say that there's necessarily, the supervisor has to also be a behaviour support practitioner at a level above you.
Who also self-assessed.
And then you can go straight into this really well-funded, practice. It's funded consistently. It's really well recognised by the government. There's a massive need for it because we are seeing like this sort of, the government.
The second secret word is eucalyptus.
It recognises that behaviour support is something that's needed. But so you're seeing all of these people come out of their degrees and go straight into PBS because it's financially viable. The work is there, it's front-loaded funding. You have to do an FBA. You have to write a behaviour support plan. You have to lodge it with, the Quality and Safeguard Commission, who are the body responsible for the safety and rights of individuals under our insurance scheme. And there are other requirements that go along with it. But I think, the monitoring of what that actually looks like in practice isn't there in the way that it needs to be. So in terms of the quality of up and coming behaviour analysts, I think the education and the, certification requirements are really strong. I think we're likely to see less competent clinicians over time because of those two problems that I just mentioned, which is a big problem, right? It's really concerning.
Wow. That's surprising that there's that big of a difference. So you would think that the CBA folk would be the ones doing the behaviour support.
Wouldn't you? Yeah. You really, really would. And so, that's not to say necessarily, I think that professional humility is also really important here. That's not to say that CBAs are the only people who could do quality behaviour support, right? There's a lot of individuals from other disciplines who have dedicated their life to, upskilling themselves and learning how to do this well. But it is strange to see, all of this funding and recognition and government support for behaviour support without the corresponding recognition and support of, I guess, the profession that essentially, is PBS. Obviously the ABA versus PBS argument is complex, but you really can't say that PBS would exist without ABA or that ABA doesn't form the foundations of PBS. And so that's interesting as well. Like sometimes you'll find people who kind of say, well, I'm a non-ABA behaviour support practitioner. And it's like, what does that mean?
Exactly.
Tell me what that means. And again, I think this arcs back to that issue of a lot of misconceptions about what ABA is and isn't. And so when you actually have the conversations with those people and break it down, you can kind of go, well, actually, you are using the principles of ABA. You just don't recognize that you are. So yes, it's an interesting time in Australia.
And that's something I noticed with Australia, and I noticed in the UK to a lesser extent, was sort of this big separation between PBS and ABA, so much that it's completely different people doing different jobs. And in fact, I think like in the early days of PBS, it seemed to be, at least the early days when I started getting familiar with it in the UK, it seemed to be a lot of nurses that were doing psychiatric nursing and whatnot were kind of involved in PBS, not behavior analysts. They started getting sort of BCBA trained kind of down the road. I interviewed John Wooderson and Oliver Roschke, right? We talked a lot about PBS, and those guys are both BCBAs. John's a BCBAD, and we talked a lot about the origins of PBS, which are all, PBS was invented by behavior analysts.
Yeah.
And is behavior analysis without some of the yucky stuff, I think, pretty much, if you want to kind of put it in simple terms. But
that's a really
right?
interesting distinction, though, because I think, like, if you look at what ABA is like in Australia, like I was talking about, how it is a bit different from the practice in North America, it is like everyone lives and breathes the constructional approach, I think, without even realizing or labeling that that's necessarily what they're doing. It's very much what we're taught to do, and like not only from the university perspective and the teaching, but also because of the culture and the climate in terms of, disability in Australia. Yeah. And I think that's the other really fantastic element of the NDIS. Lots of people will be like, there's nothing good about the NDIS. There's lots of good things about the NDIS. But I think one of the amazing societal and cultural shifts we've seen is that it has pushed disability into the forefront. Disability and disability rights are in mainstream media all the time. And it's because we're talking about money for a lot of it, but, it's provided this amazing platform for individuals who live with disability to say, you guys are talking about money, but this is actually what my life looks like on a day-to-day basis. And this is why these funding cuts are such a massive problem, because it means that I can't, do X, Y, and Z. And so I think as a society, we have really been flooded with a lot of disability-specific content in the last 5 years. And I think that's fantastic. It's really helped move away from that medical model of disability and to, as a society, really be looking at what are the rights of the individuals with disability? How are we making sure those rights are upheld in practice of therapeutic supports, but also just in society, on a day-to-day basis, which is fantastic.
You're coming near the end of your term as president. And so what were your priorities when you kind of first started, and how do you feel it's gone?
I would say my priorities have shifted. So I guess obviously the NDIS and the advocacy issue was a really big one, but it wasn't something that was necessarily on my presidential plate when I stepped into this role. Something that I was really passionate about at the time that I came onto the board was looking at clinical governance and quality assurance in the ABA space. And so we had Gina Green over as a keynote speaker, and she and I did a panel together on what quality assurance and quality assurance and governance looks like. So very much looking at sort of like the CASP and the ACQ kind of models from the States. And so what I was really passionate about at that time was trying to work towards something similar for Australia. I think, looking back now, gosh, that feels like such a long time ago. It wasn't. It was 2 years ago. So this would have been as I was coming into my president-elect term. it seems like a really important goal. I'd say it's still a really important goal, but we have much bigger fish to fry. And so when I came into the presidency, something I was really passionate about was member engagement. And I think that was because I had been on the outside looking in, and I knew a lot of the concerns that members were having, in terms of the profession, the landscape, but also what ABA Australia was doing to support them with that. And so that was something I was really passionate about, because I just, your heart really bleeds for people who have poured their life and soul and time into this profession. And I think no one goes into this and stays in it if they don't really love the work. It isn't well paid, despite what the media likes to say. It's really, really, really hard work. And it would be so easy to pivot and go into PBS, or to, go over here, or, we could be working in the government in a policy advising position and probably be getting a lot more money. And so I guess I felt really responsible for this cohort of people who are incredibly passionate about the work, really, really committed to the work and to the individuals they support, but were really struggling and felt really scared, I think, about what career longevity looks like for them, and also what that would mean for the individuals who rely on their support. And so my focus has very much shifted to engaging with that member base, listening to them, and then trying to feed those messages back into the board and, enact changes and prioritize the things that our members needed prioritizing. And the really big thing there was NDIS advocacy. And so that has been I'd say my primary goal over the last 12 months. And it will stay my goal as I transition out of the presidency. So I'll move into a past president position, but I'll still be on the board. And I think the other thing that I've realized is, sorry, my ears are blocked. The other thing I've realized is government advocacy it's a relationships gig. In order to get in the room, have the right conversations with the right people, you really need to have the right relationships with people across related sectors, and to be engaging the right stakeholders for support, because we really can't do it alone. We need, the argument to be coming from lots of different angles about why we should be recognised. And a really important part of that is also listening to the community that we serve, right? So engaging directly with service recipients, engaging with families, and making sure that their positive experiences of ABA are being brought to the forefront, because there's a lot of negative stuff about ABA in the media, but there really isn't enough of a platform for individuals who have good things to say about it. And something else that I've learned through this engagement with different stakeholders is that a lot of people who have good stories to tell about ABA are really scared to do it, because of the backlash that they receive from the community online. And so that's just heartbreaking, One, these are often the individuals who are caring for profoundly autistic children and don't have the time to be, going on the media, going on interviews and, doing all this stuff. They're just trying to keep their child alive and advocate for them on a day-to-day basis. But they have such an important story to tell. And I do feel like that's changing a little bit, both in Australia, but also globally. We are seeing this sort of shift towards, recognition of those at the profound end of the spectrum, and making sure that that population is adequately, recognized, that they're better represented in the research, in the media, all of this kind of thing. But that's been something I've been really passionate about. And it's been it's heavy. Right? When you engage with the member base and you engage with, the people who are trying really hard to get funding for intensive ABA to support their child, it's and saying, can you help me? What can ABA Australia be doing to help here? The weight of that is pretty significant. And so it's been a really challenging year professionally and personally. And it's something that I've really reflected on in terms of sustainability and effective governance and effective delegation of duties across the board as well. How do we ensure that the board is structured in such a way that it meets the needs of the people who really need our help, And that isn't to be critical of the association. They've done really incredible work in terms of professional self-regulation in particular. That was a huge thing that was really thrust on us by the decision made by the BACB to withdraw international certification. And they've done incredible work. But I think that the landscape and the goalposts have shifted, and we need to be really responsive to that shift. So yes, I'm passionate to continue the work, even if my presidency is ending. And I think once you step into this space and you start to get a bit of traction, you really can't step back until the work is done is kind of the sense that I have, So yes, we'll see. We'll see what happens next.
I'm curious about how the field is addressing kind of diversity and inclusion in Australia. I mean, Australia has not been known to be all that great in that realm, particularly when it comes to its Indigenous and Aboriginal peoples, and everything from. I learned a lot from Deb Fernando, as we talked about in the beginning, and sort of just about some of the sort of asinine laws around recognizing personhood and even the existence of some of these folks as being living beings.
Yeah.
What kind of work is being done there?
I mean, I would say honestly, probably not enough. And I think that behavior analysis is probably doing as well as the rest of Australia and as well as the other allied health professions, but that doesn't mean that we're doing well enough. And so I think, like you said, as a society and as a culture, we have a lot of work to do in terms of, better recognition, understanding, and, really embracing Indigenous cultures and developing better ways to embed cultural competence and cultural safety across, all areas of society, not just medical or therapeutic supports. Something that, I think quite specifically ABA Australia could do. I mean, that's not to say that there aren't things happening, like I have staff members who are currently going through coursework at Monash and Griffith, and they're like, oh yeah, this is talked about. Like we have subjects on cultural safety and cultural competence. And I'm like, that's awesome, because I didn't, and so I think we are starting to see some shifts there. We do, I would say, have like a handful of Indigenous practitioners who are doing really good work. But I think that we have a responsibility to elevate their voice more and to make sure that, they have a good enough platform to share their knowledge. There is a workshop coming up. So we have our annual conference next month, and there's a workshop on cultural competence and cultural safety with an Indigenous woman, which I think is going to be fantastic. And there's been really a lot of interest in that. But it's breadcrumbs, right? Like it's not nearly enough. And one of the other things that, I struggle with as a certified behavior analyst, like renewing my certification, is that when I'm looking at those, cultural PD, I'm like, I actually don't have a lot of good Australian options. Like, I'm like, a lot of my cultural PDUs I get online from, like wherever, but they're not actually specific to the Australian context or the Indigenous population that we have here in Australia. And so I think that's really something as well. I'm like, man, my to-do list and my list of priorities is really long. But I think that is something else that ABA Australia needs to be doing better, is, having more specific requirements about what cultural PDUs are acceptable and having better options available to certificates in Australia for Australian specific PDUs. And that's not just talking about the Indigenous population. Like, we're a really rich multicultural population. And, I think culturally safe practice in Australia is complicated because we do have so many cultures that we're, supporting. And I think that the complexity of that needs to be reflected in both our education, but also our supervision and our CPD requirements. Yes.
And who's the speaker at the conference?
Her name is Rachel Dunn. So she's an Indigenous woman from Tasmania, I believe, who will be talking about culturally informed practice in behaviour support specifically. So that should be good. We haven't had Deb yet at an ABA Australia event, but I will work on that as well, because she was great. I think she helped me see that maybe I was overthinking what cultural safety looks like. And that's not to dismiss or minimize, how important it is. But I think this is probably quite typical of behavior analysts. We want to know exactly what we should be doing. And we're very focused on the procedures. And I think what Deb told me or taught me was to just really try to drop that a little bit, like to take more time, like to slow it down, to, engage in deep listening, to spend time yarning with Indigenous clients and to give them the time and the space to open up about, their cultural heritage and how that plays into their day-to-day life. And I think probably upon reflection, what I've been trying to do is is rush it, of kind of, or like wanting to know exactly what I should be doing and having
Yeah.
that procedure. And what Deb really taught me was that I actually just needed to like stop being weird about it, I think she said, which I thought was great. Like just drop
That's
the rope,
awesome.
just relax into it, don't be weird, like be curious, be slow, give them time. Ask them about their country, about the waterways, about
Mm,
the birds in their country, and be slow, slow it
mm,
right down. And I think Jamie, who's the Indigenous practitioner here, who's
mm.
been getting ongoing mentorship from Deb, is going to be presenting to us soon about additional things that she and Deb have been working on. But it was so interesting to me because Jamie has a lot of success in, engaging our Indigenous clients. But she's also someone who gives like 150% and who will often, like a 1 hour session will turn into a 1 hour and 45-minute session because she's having like long conversations, at pickup. And that's been something as a supervisor that I was like, rein it in, like your time is valuable. You've got other stuff to do. You shouldn't be like staying here until
Mm,
7 o'clock so that you can have these conversations. When actually, upon reflection, that's probably the reason that she has really good engagement and relationships with these families, because she takes it slow, she gives them the time, she engages in deep listening, she doesn't
mhm,
rush it, she's not procedures or protocols based, right? And so that was really important for me, I think, to hear from Deb and to reflect on and kind of go, okay, well, now that I know that, what are my responsibilities as her supervisor and as her employer? How do I foster this? And how do I,
mm,
make sure she has adequate space and
mm,
time in her schedule to engage in this work, because it's obviously incredibly important from a cultural safety perspective and is yielding much better outcomes for the Indigenous families that she supports. And that's like, it's just not something I would have thought about, like, and
right.
I spent a lot of time thinking like, how can I do better? Like, what checklist should I be using? Like, what,
Mm,
like, where's the manual on how I, engage in culturally safe practice? And I think probably I have been overcomplicating it, and I needed to be slow and curious, which was really interesting.
it's called Reclaiming Neurodiversity, Indigenous Perspectives on Autism, Relationality, and Inclusion. And it's written by Louis Bush, who is a well-known behavior analyst here in Canada, and Grant Bruno, who has been doing incredible work across the country in the Indigenous autism space. The two of them together are doing some real magical things in terms of incorporating Indigenous perspectives into autism services. So I wanted to
Yeah, amazing.
knock
So you have
them
to
in.
send me that article.
I will, yeah. The third secret word is bridge. Where do you see ABA in Australia over the next decade heading?
I mean, if I'm successful in my objectives, and if ABA Australia is successful in their objectives, then I think we'll be in a pretty good place. But what I would really like to see is, yeah, better recognition of the field and the really valuable and important work that we do. I would like to see ABA also better represented outside of the disability sector. Like we're starting to gain traction within education settings as well. Like two of the states in Australia now sort of endorse, and I think Queensland maybe even has like scholarships for like teachers to go and do a master's in ABA, which is like amazing. But, looking at like health and aged care and like all of these other sectors that I think we could contribute really valuably in. I guess I would also be aiming for like a lot of improvement in how ABA is understood and perceived by the mainstream public and by the media, and stronger engagement in those conversations, because it's really important. More culturally informed practice, absolutely, and better scaffolding for what that looks like, both in education supervision and clinical practice. Um, and I mean, the thing that I'm really concerned about at the moment as well is the future of early intervention in Australia. And I think, the closure of AIOU earlier this year was devastating, um, for the field and for early intervention professionals. And I think I would love to see a shift back to recognizing, I guess, quality early intervention as an investment rather than as a cost. Um, because we've really lost sight of that at the moment. And I'm really scared about what that will look like for the kids who most rely on quality and intensive early intervention services. Um, but I'm also really hopeful. There's some really fantastic work happening. Um, there's a team at the Kids Research Institute over in Western Australia who I think they got a $5 million grant to look into, I guess, like analyzing different profiles of autism and developmental disabilities and trying to identify, which cohorts and in which context will respond best to which type of behavioral intervention and at which intensity, which I think is really, really important work. So, yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see what the next 5 years looks like. Hopefully I don't have a heart attack from stress and I'm still here. but yeah, we'll see. Time will tell. And everyone will just have to keep working their little butts off. And we'll see. We'll see how we go.
After almost 20 years, what's in the field, what's been most meaningful for you?
That's a big question. I guess, obviously the work with families is probably the most meaningful. And I think, the relationships that you build with the kids that you work with and the families that you work with, they stay with you forever, even if you don't continue working with those families. And I think, like, I was reflecting on, that family that I'm still in touch with from my, RBT kind of days. And I think, that's really something that stays with you for a really long time. And I think, the work that we do and the impact that we can have on a child's life and on their trajectory is so profound. And that spills out into, the quality of life, not just of them, but also of their family and, the richness that society gains, when that person can be meaningfully included into society as well. And I think, yeah, that's probably the thing that I think most about it. It's the thing that keeps me coming back, right, on a day-to-day basis, even when things are really, really hard. Yeah, I'd say
A-
that's been the most meaningful.
And what advice would you give to newer clinicians entering the field?
Finding good supervision. I think, finding a supervisor who is like genuinely interested in upskilling you and helping you be a better clinician. That might mean a supervisor who is, critical or hard on you at times. But I think that's really important. And staying in that, big pond for as long as you can. Like, please don't go out and start your own clinic a year out of uni. It won't benefit you in the long term, and it certainly won't benefit the individuals that you're working with either. Um, you know, really soak in the knowledge of people who have been in the profession for a long time and be genuinely curious and reflective across your entire practice, but I think especially in your early career years, especially in those first 5 to 10 years. Um, yeah, and think beyond the techniques as well. Like, again, I think this is something that we're really good at in Australia. Um, but, some of those messages from, Hanley's team about things like prioritizing relationships over procedures and, these are things that I think are incredibly important. Um, and so again, you'd want to find a supervisor who, is true to science and is technical enough, but who sees the bigger picture as well.
To kind of finish off, if there was one thing you wish people outside of Australia understood about ABA in your context.
I think the thing that really strikes me about ABA in Australia is the collaborative and the close-knit nature of it. And so I think it was, Renee Collins, who is a clinical director and owns a clinic called Super Kids. Renee is one of the people responsible for bringing, voices like Greg Hanley and Ditu Rajaraman to Australia. So really lives and breathes compassionate ABA. But she said something on social media recently about, as a clinic owner, the thing that surprises people the most is that my biggest supporters are other clinic owners. They're the types of people that should technically be my competitors, but they're not. And I think that really is what ABA is like in Australia. We're small, we're close knit, like we're growing, but it really is an all for one and one for all kind of attitude. which is really nice, I think, and maybe not something that you would see in North America or, some of the other countries.
Awesome. Niesha, thanks for coming on Behaviour Speak. This was awesome.
Thanks so much for having me, Ben. It's been nice. Look, the sun's out now. It's a regular time of day.
Yeah, and the sun's going down here.
Oh, very good. Well, thank you, Ben. That was great.
Awesome. If you enjoyed today's conversation with Niesha Illingworth, here are a few other Behaviour Speak episodes that continue these themes of international practice, positive behavior support, and culturally responsive behavior analysis. First, check out episode 148, Behavior Analysis in First Nation Communities of Australia with Deb Fernando. Deb shares her experiences supporting First Nations communities across Australia and offers important perspectives on culturally responsive behavior analysis in Australian contexts. You may also enjoy episode 43, Family-Centered Positive Behavior Support with Dr. Joseph Lucician. Niesha's discussion of parent coaching and prevention aligns closely with Dr. Lucician's work on empowering families through positive behavior support. Finally, listen to Beyond Behavior Reduction, Reclaiming the Constructional Approach in PBS with Oliver Roschke and John Wooderson. Their discussion about moving beyond compliance and behavior reduction toward quality of life complements Niesha's emphasis on prevention, systems thinking, and person-centered practice. You can find these episodes along with more than 270 conversations exploring behavior, psychology, neuroscience, culture, and human connection at behaviorspeak.com. As always, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time on Behaviour Speak. You can find us on Instagram and TikTok and subscribe to our YouTube page at Behaviour Speak. And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.